Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. The title of the webinar is New Rules for Small Businesses, the 2019 Small Business Government Contracts Regulatory and Administrative Changes and what they mean for 2020. Before we begin, we needed to cover a few administrative items. First, if you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer these questions during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource widget. We encourage you to download the slide deck and any other items you may find useful. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is CLE accredited and approved for 1.8 hours of general credit in Missouri and approved for 1.5 hours of general credit in Illinois and California. We award CLE based on attendance for the entire 90 minutes. From time to time, you will be required to click a pop-up screen to reflect your continued engagement. We value your opinions and appreciate your participation in the course. So with that, let's go ahead and get started on today's presentation. So before we begin, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of an idea of who I am. The screen has a brief bio of the type of work that I do, but I think what's probably most pertinent to folks attending is the fact that I work regularly with small contractors, small business contractors, and large businesses who are government contractors who do business with small businesses. I'm also active in some bar associations, small business committees, which often means I'm in some organizations where we're talking about these regulations as they come out. Sometimes the bar associations actually submit comments on these rules as they are in their preliminary stages, and we're also often interfacing with the SBA as the rules are going through the rulemaking process. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about today, we'll start off talking about some just general changes at the SBA and what that means for small businesses, and then we will talk about some revisions to the standards for determining small business size based on receipts, general updates to SBA regulations, revisions to the HUBZone program, and then we'll move to some proposed rules which deal with potential revisions to mentor-protege programs and general SBA regulations, as well as the upcoming Women-Owned Small Business Program certification. So generally, as we go through today's discussion, I'm going to focus on what contractors, whether they be large or small contractors, need to know as far as the changes that happened in 2019 and what to expect for 2020. But we will also address a little bit of the changes that apply to the buyer side, just so that you all have an idea of what the government buyers are going to be doing that may be a little bit different. We are not going to go through the rules in chronological order. I think that would be a bit difficult to follow. So what we'll do is go through the rules based on the ones that are final, which means the rules that folks have to comply with now, as well as then moving into the rules that are proposed, which are the rules that the agency being SBA is in the middle of trying to figure out how to implement these rules. So they're not final. Things may change in them, and so that's why I have not put them at the top of the program, because it is something that is going to probably change over time. And finally, I'll note that we've organized these by topic. I've also tried to organize them so that it's a little bit more focused on the general items first and then more specific programs. So general small businesses are going to be hit on the final rules first, and then again on the proposed rules first. Now, before we get into the substance, though, I wanted to have an idea of who was on the line today. So before we move on, I just wanted to get you guys to fill out a quick polling question about the company you work for. So if you could take a second and let us know who you work for. So we'll give it just another couple of seconds for any last-minute entries. So it looks like the vast majority of folks are not small in any category, so probably folks at large businesses that work with small businesses. And then we've got some other folks from women-owned small business and small businesses generally. No veteran-owned small businesses, 8As, or hub zones. However, we will spend some time, as we talked about on the overview, talking about hub zones. And part of why I think that's going to be helpful for folks even who are not hub zones are people who are doing business with small businesses who are hub zones will benefit from that discussion, as well as companies that are considering setting up shop in a hub zone. So what we're going to talk about before we get into the rules is just a very brief overview of what has been happening at the U.S. Small Business Administration in 2019. So at the beginning of 2019, the administrator for the SBA was Linda McMahon. Some folks know her from her wrestling fame, her ownership of the wrestling company, and she had been the administrator for SBA for the beginning of the Trump administration, and she announced she was leaving at the end of March, and she, I believe now, is working for Trump Super PAC. After she left, Chris Pilkerton took over as the acting administrator, and his role generally there is the general counsel at SBA. And usually when there's an acting administrator, they're just kind of keeping things going that had been started before, not really doing much as far as changes on their own. But of course, you know, we don't have acting administrators permanently, and President Trump announced his intent to nominate Jovita Carranza, who was then Treasurer of the United States, in April, and he sent the nomination to Congress on August 1st, and she was actually just recently confirmed to the position, and she was confirmed on January 7th of this year. And why I think it's relevant to talk about this change in administration is that this change can impact small businesses in a number of different ways, and it can impact the rules that we're going to be talking about in a number of different ways. The first is that a new administrator may change current SBA regulatory focus and efforts. Every administrator, every person has their own passions and experience that they bring to their job. And so whenever a new administrator comes in, that may impact the speed at which things are happening at the agency for certain efforts. That can happen because an administrator may move and reallocate resources, which may mean that resources are taken away from completing efforts that have gotten off the ground. It also may mean that there is a change of staff in various areas of the agency, and that can also slow down change. So I point all of this out not to say that we are for sure going to see any redirection from the agency, but to note that there are probably going to be some things to look out for as far as we may not see SBA acting exactly as it did in 2018 and the beginning of 2019. Another thing I wanted to talk about briefly is the Small Business Mentor Protege program, because that is kind of one of the big things that had been happening at SBA prior to Ms. Carranza's confirmation. It was something that began in the fall of 2016, and this program has now crossed the 1,000 number mark for active mentor-protege pairs. And it crossed this mark sometime around December, and some mentors and proteges are starting to reach their limit on the number of pairs that they can have. So for many mentors, they already have about 2 to 3 proteges, which is really what SBA limits them to have. And a handful of protege firms have actually already reached their lifetime limit of 2 mentors. A couple of other things that are happening at SBA related to this program is that at one point, approval for the all-small mentor-protege program was taking about 8 to 12 days. It's now double that and taking at least 5 weeks from what we're seeing based on SBA statements and experiences of folks who've been through the program. So I say that just so that folks understand that if you had gone through this process earlier in the kind of life cycle of this program, back in fall of 2016, for instance, and are trying to go through it now with another mentor or another protege, you may see that there are some differences in the procedures that you're encountering. And related to that, there's going to be some significant changes to that program that we're going to talk about later, but they are proposed changes, so we're not going to get into that just yet. What we're going to start with then are our final rules that the agency issued in 2019. So the first rule that we'll talk about is one related to small business size standards. And actually the first 3 rules we'll talk about relate to the size standards for small businesses. This rule was published back in July of 2019, and it became effective in August. And what it did is it adjusted the monetary-based industry size standards for inflation. SBA did this because it recognized that some businesses may have lost their small size status eligibility due to inflation, and the agency increased the size standards to help them. The last time the agency made such an increase was an inflation-based increase, I should say, was in 2014. And what this increase did was it increased all receipts-based size standards by multiplying their then current level by 1.0837 and then rounding it to the nearest $500,000. And SBA is required to look at these size standards every 5 years. SBA does not have to make an inflation-based adjustment when it looks at them, but it's required to at least consider doing so to make sure that the public feels confident that SBA is monitoring inflation and is considering doing these adjustments. What this change did not do is it didn't look at individual size standards. That is something that SBA does under a different review. SBA has a rolling 5-year review of size standards that's mandated by statute. And generally what SBA does when it looks at those under the 5-year rolling review of the size standards is it looks at things on the industry structure, things like the average firm size, startup costs and entry barriers, industry concentration, distribution of firms by business size, and federal contracting trends. So for instance, if a small business share of federal contract dollars relative to small business is high or low compared to the total industry's receipts. That is, again, a different type of review that the SBA goes through for specific size standards. This change, this rule, the one that was implemented, is one that was just an across-the-board adjustment for inflation. And this change, SBA estimated, would impact about 90,000 additional firms. And by that I mean SBA was estimating that about 90,000 more companies would qualify as small due to this inflation increase. So this table on your screen now just shows you what the changes look like as far as what they moved from and what they moved to. This is a table that I pulled from the final rule, and it should show you kind of the impact of the rounding of the numbers and the impact on the various sizes of industries. The industries that, or the size that was impacted the most, that had the most number of industries impacted, was the move from 7.5 million to 8.1 million, which was rounded to 8 million. So a lot of companies that used to have a $7.5 million standard are now finding themselves at $8 million, and similarly, a lot of companies used to be under a $15 million size standard and are now at a $16.5 million size standard. So again, this is just an example of, or a chart showing some of the moves that were made, or actually all of the moves that were made as far as the monetary-based size standards and where they are now and the number of industries that are impacted. So the next rule I'm going to talk about is one that I'm not going to spend very much time on, and the reason being is that the biggest takeaway that you guys probably should get from this is that after you, go about your work and you realize you need to take a closer look at some of these size standard changes, that this is not probably the one you're going to be looking at. So this rule was issued by SBA in April of 2019 and became effective immediately. And all this rule really did was advise the public that SBA had looked at and revised its methodology white paper for explaining how it establishes, reviews, or revises its size standards. And SBA explained that it was going to use this paper for that 5-year rolling review of industry-based size standards. So all of those things that I was mentioning earlier that SBA is supposed to look at, the average firm size, startup costs, all of those things. This paper that was published in April of 2019 explains the methods that SBA would use in doing that review. SBA issued this mostly because it was trying to incorporate some amendments from a statute and address public comments that they had gotten regarding the methodology that they've been using. But again, this is not something that's going to directly impact the way you small businesses are doing business with the government. It's also not going to directly impact the way large businesses are doing business with small. So there's not anything here particularly relevant to what you're going to be seeing day to day. It may impact your specific size standard, but really the biggest takeaway here is that this is not the rule you want to be looking at if you're trying to get your arms around SBA's changes on size standards. The ones you want to look at are the one I just mentioned, or the next one, which is final rule number 3. And this rule got a lot of press coverage from 2018 up until it was actually passed into a final rule. And this is the rule related to the Small Business Runway Extension Act. And SBA published this final rule in December, and it became effective on January 6th of this month. What this rule does is it changes the period for calculating annual average receipts for size standards. Before this, SBA used a 3-year period, and then after this rule was issued, SBA has moved to a 5-year period for calculating size. Now, again, SBA did this because, and I say this with an asterisk, Congress mandated that SBA do this via the Small Business Runway Extension Act. And I say there's an asterisk because SBA actually says that the Act did not apply to its calculation, but that it would move to a 5-year period, which the Act required, for consistency with what the Act actually did apply to. And SBA said, but we're not going to do that right away because the statute doesn't apply to us. We have to go through a rulemaking process to make this effective. And as you can imagine, this caused a lot of consternation in the industry. So Congress did not agree with SBA's position. Well, I should say some members of Congress did not agree with SBA's position. Some felt that the Act did apply to SBA. Some were trying to pass laws to mandate that SBA implement this law as soon as possible, and to state that the law did apply to SBA, and to make any rulemaking by SBA retroactive to when the statute was signed into law, which was December of 2018. But SBA held quite firm on this, and SBA said that there had to be a rulemaking, and GAO upheld SBA's position. And I mean by GAO upheld that position, some folks had tried to protest an agency's decision to use only a 3-year period for calculating average annual receipts during this kind of gray time between the passage of the statute and this rule. And SBA said, no, we are still in a 3-year period based on the rules, and that's what agencies and small businesses need to use to calculate size. GAO said, we will defer to SBA on this, and so SBA came out the winner really on that issue. And I've talked about this disagreement for a couple of reasons, but it's particularly relevant to what this means for companies going forward in 2020, because the final rule noted that SBA will use a 3-year calculation period if a company certifies their small business or certified their small business prior to the effective date. So any proposals that were submitted prior to January 6, 2020, the companies had to calculate their average annual receipts based on a 3-year standard. Even if SBA is looking at a proposal next week, they're going to look at the date that the certification was made, which would have been probably weeks before that. And that means that this is not a retroactive rule. It applies only effective January 6th. So some notable aspects of the rule are, of course, the period changed from 3 years to 5 years. This change only applies to receipts-based size standards. It does not apply to employee-based size standards, and this change also does not apply to the business loan and disaster loan programs that SBA is in charge of. Those, SBA noted, the business loan and disaster loan programs are going to be addressed in a separate proposed and final rule. SBA also, in this final rule, put in place a 2-year transition period. And during this 2-year transition period, firms can choose either to use a 3-year calculation period or a 5-year calculation period. And this transition period was something that those of us who had been keeping an eye on this rule had expected based on comments from SBA administration. It was apparent that SBA had gotten some feedback and decided to implement this, but I think for folks who had just read the proposed rule, this may have been a bit of a surprise to them. But it really came about because SBA received 31 comments from folks after the proposed rule was issued, and those comments had requested some sort of alternative option. So they received 31 comments of people saying, you can't just automatically switch us from 3 years to 5 years because some of us are going to be hurt by this. So we need some alternative. And SBA decided to implement this transition period. And what this transition period will do, I think, or at least SBA hopes it will do, is eliminate two of the negative impacts that they had identified in the proposed rule, which were that some current small businesses would lose their status, and that would be because the additional time would, those last 2 years, or those earlier 2 years, I should say, would include a kind of unexpected spike in business, maybe 4 years ago, that would make them other than small. And then the other negative impacts that SBA was hoping, I think, would be eliminated by this would be that current smalls would also have a shorter runway for small business status. So the same idea, if somebody had, a spike in time, some people may not want a 5-year calculation period. They may have benefited from a 3-year calculation period. So SBA said, you know what, we're not going to hurt those folks who had been counting on having a 3-year period. We'll do this 2-year transition period. And this 2-year transition period is going to go through January 6th of 2022. A couple of other things to note. The agencies that propose and use their own size standards must propose to use a 5-year average. This probably isn't going to affect most small businesses, except for those who are doing work under other agency small business programs, but that's just a quick note. And finally, there were a couple of other changes that SBA rolled into this rule, and one of the things is that they clarified that the former affiliate rule does not permit a small business concern to adjust their calculation when when the company sells a segregable division. The only way SBA says that you can adjust your calculation when you sell a part of your company is when that part of your company you're selling off is a separate legal entity. And SBA clarified that not only does that mean you can't adjust your calculation for receipts, you also can't adjust that for the number of employees you have. The other thing that this rule did was it removed Schedule K from the definition of receipts. A couple of other things that I wanted to point out for folks who are trying to wrap their arms around what did this rule mean and kind of why was there maybe so much disagreement, but also what does that disagreement, again, mean going forward for 2020, is that SBA had anticipated that this change in the rule would give large or mid-sized businesses the ability to gain small business status. So companies that were not small may be able to identify as small now. SBA also believed that advanced small businesses, so small businesses that have continued to grow, are going to be able to have longer runways or are going to be able to lengthen their small business status. SBA had also, in their proposed rule, identified the industries that they thought would be most impacted by this change. And these industries, just based on sheer number of companies that they thought would be impacted either positively or negatively, so either more likely to be in the program or potentially pushed out, which isn't going to be really much of an issue until 2022, given the transition period. But the industries most impacted are going to be professional, scientific, and technical services, construction and administrative and support, and waste management and remediation services. So I put those up there mostly so that folks who are large businesses that are in those industries may start to consider, at least it'll be worth looking at for you all in particular to know if you're potentially going to be able to identify as small going forward, because folks in your industry at least there's going to be more folks in your industry that are able to identify as small. And a couple of other things I would note as far as other impacts that SBA expects to occur because of this rule is that SBA believes that there's going to be added competition because more businesses are qualifying as small. So that can be good for the government, but may not be good for small businesses that have had a slightly smaller pool of companies they've been competing against. But SBA did identify some of the benefits that they believed they would see because of that, and that would be lower prices. And potentially, there would be more set-asides because there is now a bigger pool, because there's now going to be more companies that can identify as small. For large companies, this also may mean for you guys that you may lose access to unrestricted work. The buying agencies may now have a pool that is large enough that they can set this aside for certain small businesses. SBA also noted that they believe there is going to likely be a decrease in protests because of this. That is probably surprising to some folks, given that there's now going to be more small businesses competing for work and so more potential protesters. But SBA noted that based on their historical data, they see that after SBA moves to increase the number of companies, protests generally actually decrease. So, I mean, with that in mind, given that there are more companies now able to identify as small based on the increase in the receipts, the inflation-based increase for the receipts-based size standards, as well as this Runway Extension Act rule, there may end up being fewer protests, and that may end up being just because there's more work available for small. And by protests, I mean small business protests. The next final rule that we'll talk about is one that is where SBA says that they were implementing certain laws and clarifying certain regulations. And based on the title of this rule, which is that first bullet in all of these slides, the SBA identifies 3 laws that they're implementing and then says another small business government contracting, which I think would lead the casual reader or casual observer to believe that this is really just implementing some statutes, and if you had been familiar with the statutes, you wouldn't have paid much attention to this rule. But I would say that this rule the name of the rule is, in my mind, a bit misleading as far as what small businesses and large businesses who do work with small businesses may have expected. The crux, or I think the maybe I don't want to say more important aspect of the rule, but some of the more relevant parts of what those companies need to know is really in that other small business government contracting aspect of things. The implementation of the 2016-2017 NDAAs and the RISE Act are really quite limited as far as what they do. So the first thing that this rule did was implement those laws, which we'll talk about somewhat briefly because, again, they aren't the crux of this rule. But the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act required that buying agencies have to post notice if their acquisition plan involves substantial bundling of contract requirements. So SBA, in this final rule, implemented a regulation that would require that. SBA then are also implemented regulations that address the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act. And that act also addressed the scope of procurement center representative reviews and what can happen to non-small businesses, so generally large businesses, who fail to provide timely small business subcontracting reports. And in implementing these 2 parts of the NDAA, SBA expanded procurement center representative reviews to all acquisitions. And so the procurement center representative reviews can occur for all acquisitions that are not, and not just those that have been set aside or reserved for smalls. They can still review those that have been set aside or reserved for small businesses, but they can review all of them. The scope of those reviews of solicitations for DoD contracts, however, are limited in 5 instances, and those are going to be procurements conducted pursuant to the Arms Control Export Act, a humanitarian operation, a contingency operation, awards that would be pursuant to an agreement with the government of a foreign country in which the U.S. Armed Forces are deployed, and finally, where both the place of award and the place of performance are outside of the United States and its territories. So those are kind of the areas that Congress said are going to be limited for DoD contract reviews, or DoD solicitations by the procurement center representative. The other part of that rule, though, of the NDAA that SBA addressed was the failure of non-small companies to provide timely small business subcontracting reports. This is something that I suspect is going to be a bit more relevant to the folks attending today. And what SBA did in implementing this law was explain that a failure to provide timely subcontracting reports may constitute a material breach of the contract and considered in any past performance evaluation. Folks who have ever had to address these reports or submit them know that they are already required by 13 CFR Part 125. But really what this rule does is it includes the failure to submit the reports of one of the examples of activities that are considered a failure to make a good faith effort to comply with the plan. And so that can be an issue for large companies in their past performance evaluation. And the last part of the laws that the SBA implemented in this rule that I'll address is the RISE Act, which was a 2015 statute. And what this rule did was it implements contracting preferences for small businesses that are residing in or doing business in areas affected by a major disaster. And there's definitions in the FAR that are applicable to that, FAR 6.208 if you're curious. If those businesses will be performing the work in that area, and it also permits buying agencies to receive double credit for small business goals for such contracts. What that means is that contracting officers could set aside solicitations for emergency response contracts to allow only small businesses located in the disaster area to compete, and and then the agencies may get double credit as well. So again, something that's probably not going to affect a lot of you all as much as what the other government contracting aspect of things the agency did in this rule. So some of the other things that the agency did was they made some clarifications and changes. And although you guys can't see me, I would say clarifications in air quotes, because generally when the agency being SBA is issuing clarifications, it tends, for SBA at least, to be their implementation of policy and things that they've been doing all along. So it's not necessarily changes to the rules. Some of these are, for folks who haven't been familiar with how SBA is implementing things beyond just what the words on the text are, they may be surprised to hear that this is just a clarification. But really, for most of these items that the agency says are clarifications, they truly are. But then the agency didn't limit themselves to just clarifying things. They actually did make some changes in this rule. And We'll go through kind of the three big topics that the agency hit upon in this rule, but I'll talk about a couple of other small aspects of things beyond the three that are up there. So the first is size and status recertifications and determinations. The SBA says that a company must recertify their size and status on full and open competitions. So what that was really getting at is that whenever there is a multiple award competition and the small businesses won the multiple award contract based on full and open competition, and then they later compete for a task order or a delivery order that has been set aside for a small business, they are going to have to recertify their size and status under that task order. They cannot rely on what their size or what their status was on the date of their proposal for the full and open competition. SBA also made a clarification on what it means to, or what an other formal response to the solicitation is. And where that comes up is in IDIQ or indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, multiple award contracts that do not require offers for the contract to include price, where price is generally determined at the time of initial offer, including price. So what the agency was seeing is that there were some companies, or at least what I think SBA was seeing, is that there were some companies that were arguing during protests that other formal response to the solicitation meant that their size or a company's size should be determined at the time of final proposal revisions. SBA said, no, that's not what we mean. Size is determined at the time of initial proposal submission where price is submitted. So it was, again, this is one of those items where SBA said it was a clarification, and for those of us who've been dealing with protests, size protests, or going through the size protest case law to help folks, that wasn't really a surprise to us. But maybe a surprise to folks who weren't familiar with what that was referring to in the regulations. One of the other areas SBA addressed in this rule was subcontracting, and they said that non-small companies have to include indirect costs in subcontracting goals. That was something that SBA made clear. SBA also explains that a small prime contractor has to apply the analysis in 13 CFR 121.106A to determine whether independent contractors are employees or subcontractors for determining whether or not they are complying with the limitation of subcontracting analysis. So that may mean that your company, if you guys are using 1099 employees, and I say employees in air quotes there because those are generally considered independent contractors. If you are using those kind of folks to accomplish certain work, you need to make sure that you are applying the correct analysis there if you are subject to a limitation of subcontracting analysis. The SBA also explains that the SBA expanded its review of ostensible subcontractors under the ostensible subcontractor rule to set-asides and sole source contracts. The ostensible subcontractor rule, for folks who aren't as familiar with it, is whenever a small business is who is a prime contractor has a subcontractor under their government contract that is performing vital parts of the contract and that is really the contractor for all intents and purposes. And so SBA generally says that they are an ostensible subcontractor, and the small is not a small because the large is really the contractor. Prior to this rule, SBA had really only been able to look at that issue under competitive procurements, but now SBA says that they can and will look at that under procurements that have been set aside or that have been awarded as sole source contracts. A couple of other things to note about subcontracting that's not on this slide. SBA did also align some nomenclature for subcontracting compliance reviews to FAR terminology. So now hopefully things may align a little bit better there between SBA regulations and federal acquisition regulation. SBA also noted that a contracting officer has discretion to request demonstration of a contractor's limitations on subcontracting compliance. SBA also provided some exclusions from the limitations on subcontracting determinations. They excluded work that would be done, work that is required to be done by local foreign contractors, as well as direct costs that are not the principal purpose of the acquisition, and small business concerns do not provide the service, such as in for identified industries. So folks who are looking at whether or not they're complying with the limitation on subcontracting rule and have the contract that is subject to a lot of direct costs that are not part of the principal purpose of the acquisition, may want to take a closer look at that part of the rule as well. The final thing that I'll talk about in this rule is the change to the non-manufacturer rules. SBA made a pretty straightforward change that said the 500 employee size standard non-manufacturer rule does not apply to IT value-added resellers. So if you are a IT value-added reseller who's been relying on that, you can't anymore. The SBA also removed the kit assembler exception to the non-manufacturer rule. And if folks had been looking at the kit assembler exception before, what you'd need to do now is apply the multiple item rule in 13 CFR 121.406 to kit assembler acquisitions. Again, not something that's going to apply, I think, to most of the folks here, but could apply to some of you all, so just something to consider. And the final thing I'll talk about isn't on this slide. I'll just briefly address some of the changes SBA made regarding set-asides, or at least these are really more clarifications, which is why I didn't put them on there. And first, SBA noted that contracting officers can set aside orders for a multiple award set-aside contract, including those that were set aside for small businesses. SBA also clarified that a contracting officer may award set-aside contracts where only one acceptable offer is received. There apparently had been some confusion amongst contracting officers whether or not they could still award a set-aside contract if they only received two offers, whether or not that violated SBA's rule of two, and SBA said it doesn't matter that you just received one, you can still award the contract. So the final rule that I'm going to talk about is the small business changes to the HUBZone program. As I mentioned at the top of the program, this was something that I think will apply to non-HUBZone small businesses and large businesses, in part because really what SBA was trying to do with this change was to encourage more businesses to set up shop in HUBZones. They were really trying to make this program easier for companies that were HUBZones to comply with the program requirements, make it easier for folks or more attractive to folks who were considering joining the program, and also to make it an easier methodology for procurement for the contracting officers and the procuring agencies. SBA, I have the reasons up there why SBA did this, but I will note that this was clearly I don't want to say a pet project, but a passion for Rob Wong, who is the SBA's Associate Administrator for the Office of Government Contracting and Business Development. This was a program that when he came into office, or at least based on things he said, when he came into office, this was a program he really wanted to make some changes to. And again, he wanted to make these changes because he wanted to increase small businesses' use of this program, and he wanted to make it easier for the agencies who were potentially going to be having contractors under this program. And he's noted that there have not been any comprehensive amendments to this program since it was implemented almost 20 years ago. And, SBA has learned a lot about what this program can and can't do, and so that's part of why some of these changes have been made. For folks who aren't as familiar with this program, really a company can be a part of it just, from a very basic level as far as explanation goes. A company can be part of this if they have a principal place in a hub zone, which is designated by certain maps that really, it's truly maps that explain what hub zones are. And if the company also has 35% of their employees who reside in one or more hub zones. So the HUBZone program changes. Some of the changes here are ones that I find notable. Folks who are dealing with some of the nitty-gritty parts of the program may have other things that they wanted to know, but I think the items that I've selected and put up here are only part of the changes that were made by this rule, but I think can help explain what some of these changes really do. And how this program may be easier for folks to comply with. So the first is that the rule revised or clarified or eliminated more than 20 definitions from the regulations. So there's a lot of things. If you've been working with somebody who is part of a hub zone, or you're considering starting up one and they try to tell you what something means, there's going to be a lot of things that are different and that you need to make sure to go and look at. And those, some of those definitions that are going to be particularly important to compliance are the definitions for attempt to maintain, which is attempt to maintain certain levels of employment, employee, who an employee is for purposes of this program, as well as what does reside mean for purposes of this program, which is tied to employee and attempt to maintain. So some of the big picture things that this program did was it changed some eligibility requirements and it froze some things. And I use freezes in quotation marks in part because really that's the way SBA was describing what this rule did. It really was intended to freeze things, and they kept referring to things as freezes or things would be frozen. So Congress actually mandated that SBA freeze these HUBZone maps as of December 2017. And that was because, a company who was trying to comply with this may set up shop in a hub zone, and then the hub zone changes, the maps are updated based on all of the criteria that goes into deciding whether or not something is a hub zone. And just for clarification for folks who aren't as familiar, hub zone refers to historically underutilized business zone. So if, for instance, a zone becomes more utilized, it may fall off of the hub zone map. But SBA was directed by Congress to freeze those maps as of December 2017 and freeze that map until December 2021, which basically meant that if somebody believed that they were doing business in a hub zone on, November 30th of 2017, they could still count on the fact that where their office was still going to be considered to be a hub zone in right now, today of January of 2020. SBA, though, took that kind of message a little bit further, and they said that a principal office would be deemed to be in a hub zone for at least 10 years if the company owned it at the time of certification, or had a long-term investment in it at that time of initial certification. And really, a long-term investment, SBA explained, meant a lease was maintained or, again, a property was owned. So this actually, this principal office change or kind of freezing of things occurred following some commentators' recommendations or commenters' recommendations after the proposed rule. And these commenters were making this comment potentially based on the provisions of the 2018 NDAA, but also because SBA had recommended some changes to employee residency, there was a bit of a freeze. And, these commenters seemed to be saying, well, if you're going to freeze things for employees as well, why not do it for the principal office aspect of the rule? And so the employees are going to also be deemed to be in a HUB zone, or I should say residents of a HUB zone, if they stay a company employee. Before this, if a company hired an employee who lived in a HUB zone, and then that employee decides to move to another area that's a bit more affluent or a bit more utilized as far as business goes, and no longer is living or residing, I should say, in a HUB zone, then the company would not be able to count that employee as meeting that 35% threshold. The SBA realized that that was actually prohibiting some companies from investing in their employees because they felt these companies were seeing employees as quite fungible and risky as far as potentially leaving them behind after they'd invested money. So a number of HUBZone companies weren't particularly invested in their employees, and SBA felt like that was not really the purpose of this rule. So SBA implemented this change that would allow a company to consider an employee to be a HUBZone resident as long as the person remains an employee of the firm, even if the person moves to a location that is not in a qualified HUBZone area or an area where, or if the employee's residence also ceases to be qualified as a HUBZone. So again, if the HUBZone map changes. The SBA's comments suggest that this rule could be applied retroactively. It's not 100% clear, but it could be applied retroactively to companies that are HUBZone companies that have had employees move but would fall under these criteria. A couple of other things to note is that a concern, HUBZone concern is going to be eligible for, is going to be considered a HUBZone for 1 year after their initial certification or after their recertification. Previously, a HUBZone, like most small business contracting programs, a HUBZone company would have to be considered a whatever type of small business company based on the date of their certification for as small as part of their offer with a price. SBA has carved out an exception for HUBZones and said that's not going to be the case. We're going to look at HUBZones based on the time they certified to us, SBA, and based on the time they recertified to us. So that means that if a company was in compliance with the HUBZone requirements on July 1st of 2020 and they submit a proposal on September 1st of 2020 and have had employees drop off and are below the 35% threshold, that's not going to matter. They were in compliance at the time of their certification, so that's all SBA is going to look at as far as whether or not they were in an eligible HUBZone company for purposes of that procurement. Some other changes that are going to, that came about from this rule is the time for recertification. So I mentioned that a concern has to recertify for after they've done their initial certification. Previously, under the HUBZone program, they would only have to go through a 3-year recertification process known as a triennial recertification. SBA, though, because of the benefits that these companies are going to get has moved to an annual recertification and a full document review recertification or program examination every 3 years. So the annual recertification would really be something that is just a recertification. There's not going to be a requirement up front, at least, for supporting information or documentation, but SBA could, of course, request that. SBA also addressed a couple of other things related to certifications in this rule. They changed the timeline for initial certifications and updated submission requirements to come from certain representatives from the company. So again, not something that's going to really impact folks who are not directly going through the program right now, but just as a note out there for folks who may decide to go through this program and are talking with others who have done this before, the certification program as well as the recertification for it is significantly different than what people may have done even at the beginning of 2019, so don't count on their advices helping you get through this. The last thing I'll note about the HUBZone program changes here are on protests, and I kind of touched on that a minute earlier whenever I was saying that a company may be, when their certification would be considered to have occurred, and whenever their eligibility would be determined. And the protests here, the agency clarified some differences between HUBZone eligibility protests and HUBZone size protests. So again, the eligibility protests are going to be something that SBA is going to look at on the date of, as of the date of the certification or recertification. So if a competitor protests a HUBZone's eligibility for a contract and says they are not a HUBZone, either because they are not eligible for the HUBZone program, that SBA is going to look at whether or not the alleged HUBZone was in compliance at the time of certification or at the time of recertification. It is different, however, for if a competitor alleges that the company is not small for the procurement. So that's going to be as of the date of the proposal with price. So there's going to be a couple of timelines there that are going to come into play. And because of that now difference for HUBZone protests or protests of HUBZone companies, SBA put in some clarifications for the time periods for protesting the size of service disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, and women-owned small businesses in their JVs or their joint ventures. So again, if you see some of those changes, you might have an idea now of why they've occurred. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are proposed rules. So these are some of the rules where there's nothing exactly yet to follow, and I hesitate there because hopefully if you remember from the beginning when I was talking about, or at least in some of the final rules, when I was talking about what a clarification meant for SBA, SBA really, and when they are saying they're clarifying something, SBA is often just putting into regulation what they've been doing from a legal or policy perspective. So some of these things where the agency says they are clarifying things, companies probably still want to pay attention to those clarifications because that may impact how you've been interpreting certain SBA regulations. And if you haven't been interpreting them in the same way that SBA has clarified, especially if that clarification is something that's just implementing an SBA longstanding policy, you're probably, or there's some potential issues there for you all moving forward. So some things to note about this rule change. This is another one where the agency said, we're doing one thing, consolidation of mentor-protege programs in this rule. And then we're also addressing other government contracting amendments. Again, this is another rule where that other government contracting amendments is really relevant. There's a lot of stuff there that could impact companies beyond the mentor-protege programs. So companies who are not a mentor, who are not a protege, who do not intend to be mentors or proteges, companies that are small, companies that are large, are going to be potentially impacted by this rule. And this rule is one that is still quite open, and I say quite open because the proposed rule was issued in November, and the agency had initially asked for comments to close on January 17th, or stated that the comment period would close, I should say, on January 17th. The agency on January 10th issued notice that it was extending the period for comments and extending it until February 7th. So oftentimes when SBA does that, that means they are receiving a number of comments, and they're trying to get their arms around some of these items. It also may mean SBA has received a specific request to extend the comment period because some organizations may have, an inability to provide comments by the deadline, and SBA may want to accommodate their comments. But either way, this is a rule where the comment period is still wide open, and hopefully some of you guys will have seen, based on our prior discussion, that some of these comments really do impact SBA's rules, and can really steer SBA into doing things that may really help certain types of small businesses or certain types of large businesses. So to the extent there are things in here that you really, really disagree with or really, really agree with, and you think it'd be worth the time, your company or one of the organizations you're a part of may want to consider commenting on these proposed rules, or in particular this proposed rule. So this rule does address the 8A specific requirements for the mentor-protege program and really eliminates and revises those. And it updates it eliminated and revised them to consolidate it with the SBA's all-small mentor-protege program. And in doing so, SBA also decided to update the program. So it's not just rolling the 8A program into what is existing under the all-small program, but it's also making some changes to both. The rule also is going to address a number of JV-related items or joint venture-related items, so joint ventures that are between a small business and other smalls, or a joint venture between small business and a large business. It's also going to address some size standards and protests again. So this was also SBA said they were doing this in response to President Trump's regulatory reform initiative, and following that initiative, SBA determined that these changes were going to be appropriate for them. So because the rule is set up as consolidating the mentor-protege programs, I wanted to talk about that first. And really some aspects of this proposed rule change that are relevant to folks who may be experienced with the all-small mentor-protege program or the 8A program that you may want to pay attention to are here. These are also some aspects, though, that are going to be notable for folks who are considering entering into one of these mentor-protege relationships. And some of the changes are that the small member, so the protege here, could receive profits that exceed the percent of work performed. The way the rule was written before this, SBA was hearing that some folks felt that the small had to only receive the amount that corresponded with the percent of work they performed, even if the parties wanted to award more money to the small. And SBA said, wait, we want to make sure smalls get as much as the parties feel like is appropriate, even if that exceeds the percent, so we're going to make that possible. SBA also, though, was putting in some limits here on as far as mentors go. And so this is for folks who are considering entering into this program, some things you might want to think about. The proposed rule would expressly, if implemented as written, would expressly prohibit a mentor from submitting competing offers through separate joint ventures. That's something I think SBA felt like should have been clear from the beginning, but potentially was not. SBA also was implementing preferences for supporting certain proteges in Puerto Rico. That was part of the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act that SBA was addressing there. SBA also heard some complaints from proteges that they had some mentors that provided no assistance. And for folks who are familiar with the program, they know that a protege can, or a small business, can only have 2 mentors their entire company life. And so for small businesses who found themselves in a mentor-protege relationship with a mentor who ended up being a company that provided little to no assistance, those companies were trying to figure out how to deal with that limit, because they still wanted to have 2 mentors, but they wanted to have 2 actual mentors, and they were finding that the mentor that they had was hurting them in that way, because now they could only have 1 other mentor. So SBA what they'd been doing was basically allowing those proteges to show that they hadn't gotten any assistance from the mentor, and SBA was saying, you know what, we're not going to count that against you. This rule would actually just implement that policy into the regulations. SBA also is looking at, so I'm skipping the next bullet there. We can come back to it. It's pretty straightforward, though. But related to the same issue as far as mentors and proteges not getting the assistance they want from their mentors, SBA also noted that they aren't necessarily getting the required annual reports or information from proteges that they're supposed to be. And SBA was explaining that it's hard for them to then monitor these relationships and ensure that the mentors are actually providing the support they're supposed to. So SBA said to deal with that, what they're going to do, or they would plan to do under this rule, is to terminate or give SBA the right to terminate the mentor-protege agreement if a protege fails to provide that information. SBA also noted in this, though, that, you know, again, these are proposed rules. These are not hard and fast. These are not by any means final. These are not things that companies have to comply with yet. And SBA knows that there's some things that are potentially going to change, and SBA also recognized that there are areas that they don't have enough information about to put together a rule that they felt would be as good as they want. So they've asked for specific feedback on a couple of things. And the 3 I have listed there are not the only ones, but these are areas that if folks have specific feedback on, SBA wants to hear. The first is whether or not the size of a mentor should be restricted. SBA is hearing complaints that there are small businesses that are getting mentorship, and I'm using mentorship in air quotes because that's, I think, the way SBA is hearing these complaints, that are getting mentorship from large, very, very large companies, and that's not really what, and that those large companies aren't able to provide the mentorship that the SBA intended for this program. And so some folks have requested that SBA limit the size or restrict the size of a mentor. So basically it would be a mid-size-ish mentors-only program. And SBA is wanting to hear from the industry if they think that would be ideal, or if they should keep as they've been doing and have and allow mentors to be any size. SBA also asked for input on what positive consideration should mean for a mentor for a Puerto Rican protege, for a mentor that has a Puerto Rican protege, and how that could impact the mentor's past performance. So basically, how can the agency or implement a rule that gives those mentors some positive consideration in their past performance reviews. And the last thing SBA said they wanted industry feedback on was how to stop mentors from prematurely terminating these mentor-protege arrangements. SBA had gotten feedback that there were some mentors out there that as soon as a small business that they were mentoring got the award that the parties had addressed in their first joint venture arrangement, and basically was potentially the only thing that the mentor was after, that those mentors were then terminating the mentor-protege arrangements, which meant they didn't have to provide the assistance that they had agreed to, but still then getting the benefit of essentially being a subcontractor on that procurement. And SBA isn't, based on the way the proposed rule was written, it doesn't sound like SBA was 100% sure that this was happening, but it's been hearing that it is happening, and they're trying to wrap their arms around how to implement a rule, if they do, or a regulation that would stop such activity. Now, the other government contracting aspects of this rule addressed are really some of the things that I think are going to apply across the board, whether or not you're interested in the All Small Mentor Protege Program or the 8A Mentor Protege Program, or have been part of them in the past. And these are some of the proposed changes that SBA has put into this proposed rule. The first is affiliation for joint ventures. Up till now, SBA has had what is known as a 3 and 2 rule, which means that a small business that is in a joint venture with a large business, or just any joint venture, the members of the joint venture generally are not going to be considered affiliated if they comply with this rule, which means if they limit the contracts that the JV receives to 3 contracts in 2 years. SBA has realized this is a pretty hard rule for folks to comply with, and it's meant a lot of administrative headaches for these joint ventures, so they're proposing to move it just to a 2-year rule, and the companies in the joint venture are not going to have to monitor the number of contracts awarded during that 2-year period in the same way. There is still a potential for affiliation within that 2 years or even beyond that if the companies decide to institute a new joint venture, but generally this rule should help companies that have been fighting administrative headaches for compliance with this rule. Some of the other things that SBA noted were some proposed changes to size standards and status. Up till now, a multiple award contract that has task orders awarded under it, the task orders have the same NAICS code as the multiple award contract. SBA is proposing to change things so that a task order has to have a NAICS code that is one of the multiple award contract NAICS codes and is the principal purpose of the task order. So it can't just roll down from the multiple award contract had this NAICS code, so we have to make that the NAICS code of the task order, because SBA was realizing that there were some NAICS codes on multiple award contracts that were supply contracts, for instance. And then really the task order that was getting awarded was truly more of a service task order, and SBA feels like the NAICS code has to match, so they're trying to change that. And SBA notes that this is not necessarily going to be easy for agencies to follow because the FAR and FPDS don't really permit more than one NAICS code at the multiple award contracting level. And so SBA has essentially said this is something we want to do, and it may mean that buying agencies are going to just have to use a different contracting vehicle and not the one that has the not the multiple award contract that they were originally wanting to use. So I suspect this is something that's getting comments from a number of folks. SBA is also proposing to change the task order set aside. And again, this goes to the fair and open, full and open competition on unrestricted multiple award contracts. So again, a task order would not be able to set aside, would not be able to rely on the size or the economic status of a company at the time of an unrestricted multiple award contract. Some of the changes here as far as protests go, SBA is proposing to allow their Associate General Counsel for Procurement Law to independently initiate or file a protest. This is not 100%, or this is not clear to me why SBA has put this in there, but I suspect it's because the General Counsel's office has noted some things that they would prefer to raise and don't really have an avenue to do that. So SBA is looking for a way to give internal ability to initiate or file a protest and not just wait for a competitor or a contracting office to raise a small business protest with them. SBA's change here would also permit protests to correlate with the proposed size certifications and statuses regarding multiple award contracts. SBA is also looking to make some changes to the 8A program. I'm not going to go through all of these changes. There's a lot in the rule if you're an 8A program. I don't think there were any folks on the webinar who are directly 8A. But if you do business with 8As, some of these changes may apply to them. But some things to keep in mind are that there are changes to the application timelines and the impact of missed deadlines. Another change is the elimination for a joint venture with an 8A to an 8A joint venture to seek and receive approval for all competitive contracts that they're going after. Currently, an 8A joint venture, anytime they want to submit a proposal on a competitive contract or a sole source award, they have to get SBA's approval in advance to do that. And they have to get approval of a change to their joint venture agreement. And SBA is saying there's no need to do that for competitive contracts. You still need to do it for sole source, but we are looking to eliminate that administrative headache for you 8A joint ventures. SBA is also looking to revise calculation methods and references for limits on sole source awards. So a couple of proposed clarifications that SBA put in here, and again, these are things that generally have not been, are not a surprise to those folks who've been familiar with SBA's policies in this area or kind of what industry has been doing, but SBA decided it was worth making some clarifications, and these are just some ones that I would note, is that the affiliation for joint ventures may be populated with administrative personnel. There was some confusion apparently amongst those in the industry as far as whether or not JVs could be populated at all. The regulations prohibit the joint ventures from being populated with personnel who are performing under the contracts. But then that caused some issues if the joint venture had to be have certain clearances. And I think folks who were familiar with both the affiliation rule and the rules that were applying to the clearances soon kind of wrapped their heads around. It was pretty clear that the JVs could be populated with the administrative personnel necessary to maintain the clearances, but apparently that was something SBA was getting some questions about and felt the need to address here in the rule. SBA also explained that a prime contractor could rely on their subcontractor's self-certifications unless the prime contract, as far as size, unless the prime contractor has reason to doubt that. And then as far as the 8A program goes, there were a couple of other clarifications there that I'm not going to detail, just to make sure that I give you guys enough time for some questions at the end. So a couple of other items here. SBA also requested some specific feedback on these items. Again, these are not all of the things SBA wanted feedback on, but they did have questions about JVs and affiliations. So anybody who's been a member of a joint venture with a small business may understand kind of what SBA was getting at here. But SBA was particularly looking at how to keep joint ventures static. They were dealing with issues where a joint venture may be made up of multiple small businesses, and then they were seeing that those joint ventures would have kind of rotating members, where some joint venture members would size out and then they would be replaced with new companies, and which would allow a lot of these joint ventures to maintain small business long-term contracts a lot longer than they would be able to obtain or retain otherwise. And SBA did not feel like that's within the spirit of what they were trying to accomplish. SBA also is looking at ways to prohibit government buyers from requiring that a joint venture have clearance, even if both parties have the necessary security clearances, something they're asking for feedback on. A couple of the other things they're asking for feedback on is whether or not a contracting officer should be required to consider past performance and experience of first-tier subcontractors in all instances, or only when statutorily required. As drafted, the proposed rule would only require the CO to consider that when they're statutorily required to, but SBA is signaling that they're considering at least, a requirement that COs consider that for all subs, and so they're trying to get industry feedback as to whether or not that would be helpful. They're also trying to get feedback on the non-manufacturer rule and how it should be applied to multiple item procurement. I'm not going to go through all of the changes or some of the feedback requested for the 8A program, since there's not folks on the phone and we're getting close to the end of the hour, but do know if you have folks or know folks that are part of that program that they may want to consider how those areas may play out. The last proposed rule I'll talk about is women-owned small business and economically disadvantaged women-owned small business certifications. This was a rule that took a long time for SBA to put out there, I think, in some folks' minds. SBA was required to do this from the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2015, but it took them 4 years to just get this proposed rule out, and we still have not gotten the final rule. But what this proposed rule would do is implement that a statutory requirement for these types of businesses to be certified. They can't self-certify anymore. And to implement this, SBA proposed rule had some certain aspects that I think folks who are women-owned small business may, be concerned about or at least be interested in. The first is that the certification would be free via Small Business Administration, but third parties who provide the certification could charge for it. The other aspect of the rule, I think that it was probably pretty clear by that last statement, is that SBA is not going to be the only game in town. There will also be other SBA certifications that it would accept for this. So other certifications that SBA has done for purposes of ownership and control related to 8A, HUBZone, or veteran-owned small businesses could be relied upon for certain aspects of this certification. Third-party certifiers would have to have a baseline standard for consistency. They would also be subject to periodic compliance reviews. And a business that has been denied a certification by a third-party certifier may request reconsideration and redetermination at no cost to the concern. So that'd be something that would be available to concerns that are going through a third-party certifier under this proposed rule. Recertification would have to happen for these women-owned small businesses every 3 years. And the last thing I will note, though, is that SBA was trying to align the women-owned small business program with the 8A program, and so they were looking at ways to standardize the definition of what economically disadvantaged means under both of them. So this slide just has some Federal Register postings, other rules essentially that you may be interested in case you ever want to look them up based on the titles. And these last couple of slides really just have a summary of what we've talked about on this slide. You know, I'm not going to go over word for word. This is really here for you guys, just as, you know, a reminder of what we mentioned, and then some takeaways of things that you can and should think about potentially if you are a small business or if you are a large business that does work with small businesses. Just some things to think about. I know we are at the end of the time, but if you have any questions, please do feel free to submit them through the Q&A widget, and we'll look at trying to get some answers to you guys through email. And if you have any other questions, definitely let us know. My contact information is on the last slide, but you know, for folks who have any other questions, last-minute questions, kind of hankering and sitting on your mind, feel free to put those in the Q&A widget, and I'll try to answer any for folks if I can right off the bat. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for participating in today's webinar, and we just ask that you please complete and submit the survey that will be displayed at the end. Thanks, y'all.